The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the 47th floor conference room of White & Associates Investment Bank. Richard White stood at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored suit as sharp as his presentation style. 10 board members sat before him, their attention fixed on the projection screen displaying potential profits from African mining operations. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Gentlemen, this venture represents a $2.3 billion opportunity, Richard said, clicking through his slides with practiced precision. Our geological surveys indicate vast mineral deposits in the region. Local resistance is minimal, and government cooperation has been, he paused for effect, secured. James Morton, the eldest board member, leaned forward. Environmental concerns. Manageable, Richard responded without hesitation. We've budgeted for the necessary permits and compliance measures. He didn't mention the communities that would be affected. In the world of high finance, such details were merely footnotes in impact reports. The meeting concluded with unanimous approval. As board members filed out, Richard's mentor, Thomas Pierce, clapped him on the shoulder. You're becoming everything your father hoped for, Richard. This deal could make you the youngest partner in the firm's history. Alone in his office later, Richard looked out over Manhattan's skyline. Success had always been his North Star, guiding every decision since childhood. The African mining deal would cement his reputation, fulfill his family's expectations, and silence the persistent voice of doubt that had followed him since his early days at Yale. 12 hours later, Richard sat in first class aboard Flight 207 to Johannesburg. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, he found himself staring at old family photos on his phone. There he was at 10 years old, standing straight-backed at his father's country club, learning to perfect the firm handshake that would one day seal million-dollar deals. Another swipe showed his mother at his Harvard Business School graduation, her smile tight with expectation rather than joy. The memories flooded back. Endless piano lessons he hated, but endured because culture builds character. Summer internships at investment banks while his friends traveled Europe. And the constant reminder that the White family name carried obligations. His father's words echoed, mediocrity is not an option for a White. The plane descended toward a landscape vastly different from Manhattan's steel and glass canyons. The remote African village appeared first as a cluster of buildings surrounded by vast expanses of undeveloped land. Land that would soon be transformed by industrial machinery if everything went according to plan. Richard's driver, arranged by the local office, navigated dirt roads in an air-conditioned SUV. Through tinted windows, Richard observed women carrying water jugs, children playing with makeshift toys, and men gathering for what appeared to be a community meeting. The contrast with his world was stark. The SUV stopped at the village center. Richard stepped out, his Italian leather shoes immediately coating with red dust. The conversations around him quieted. Elderly villagers watched him with undisguised suspicion, while younger ones whispered among themselves. A group of children who had been playing nearby scattered at his approach. The local chief, wearing traditional garments that seemed at odds with his modern smartphone, approached Richard. His English was clear but cold. Mr. White, we received word of your arrival. Though our hospitality traditions demand we welcome you, understand that your presence here raises concerns. Richard maintained his professional smile, the same one he'd used in countless negotiations. I appreciate your honesty, Chief Okoro. I'm here to discuss opportunities that could benefit everyone. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, but he pushed aside the discomfort. This was business, and business was what Richard White did best. As the sun set over the village, casting long shadows across the unspoiled landscape, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment would be different from any deal he'd closed before. The weight of expectations, his father's, the bank's, his own pressed down on him like the heat of the African sun. But something else tugged at his consciousness. something he couldn't yet name. The community gathering took place in an open-air pavilion, its simple wooden structure adorned with local textiles. Richard stood at the back, his jacket discarded in the heat, watching as villagers filled the space. He'd attended countless corporate events, but this was different. No champagne flutes or practiced small talk, just the raw energy of people fighting for their future. Amara stepped onto the makeshift platform. Unlike the other villagers who had kept their distance from Richard, she commanded attention in a way that made even him take notice. She wore modern clothing, jeans, and a simple blouse, but her traditional beaded necklace marked her connection to her heritage. "Our land is not a resource to be extracted," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd without a microphone. "It is our past, present, and future." Her eyes found Richard in the crowd, and she addressed him directly. "Mr. White, your company sees numbers on a spreadsheet. We see our ancestors' graves, our children's inheritance, and our community's lifeblood." Richard shifted uncomfortably. In New York, opposition could be managed with carefully worded press releases and strategic philanthropic donations. But Amara's words cut through his corporate armor. She continued, holding up a handful of soil. "This earth has sustained us for generations. The rivers your mines would poison feed our crops. The forests you would clear house our medicinal plants. What price do you put on survival?" After the gathering, Richard surprised himself by approaching her. "You make compelling arguments, Ms. Just Amara," she replied. "And arguments imply this is a debate. This is our reality." The next day, against his better judgment, Richard accepted Amara's invitation to tour the area. They walked along worn paths through lush vegetation, her feet sure in simple sandals, while he stumbled occasionally in his hiking boots. "Here," she said, stopping by a crystal-clear stream, "your environmental impact report mentions this as water source 23B. For us, it's where mothers have taught their daughters to fish for generations." She knelt and ran her fingers through the water. "Your mining operation would redirect this stream. The chemicals would make the fish unsafe to eat, if any survived." Richard found himself paying attention not just to her words, but to details he normally wouldn't notice. The way sunlight filtered through the canopy, the chorus of bird calls, the rich smell of soil after a morning rain. His phone, usually glued to his hand, remained untouched in his pocket. "Your company's projections show a 300% return on investment," Amara said, rising. "But they don't show the cost to the elderly woman who collects healing herbs here, or the children who learn our stories around these trees." Richard felt the familiar urge to counter with statistics about economic development and job creation, but the rehearsed words died in his throat. Instead, he asked, "How did you become so involved in conservation?" "I studied environmental science at university in Cape Town," she replied. "I could have stayed in the city, worked for a big corporation like yours. But this land," she gestured around them, "it calls you home." That evening, Richard found himself sitting cross-legged on a hand-woven mat in Amara's family compound. The dinner was simple, local dishes served on ceramic plates, but the conversation was rich. Amara's father, a village elder, spoke of how the community made decisions by consensus, considering the impact 7 generations forward. Children darted between the adults, protected and guided by the entire community. An elderly woman taught a young girl to grind herbs while telling stories of their medicinal properties. Richard watched as 3 generations worked together to prepare the evening meal, their movements choreographed by centuries of tradition. In New York, Richard found himself saying, "I eat dinner alone at my desk most nights," or at restaurants with clients, talking business. Amara's mother placed another portion of food on his plate. Here, food is not fuel for business. It is how we show love, how we build community. As the evening progressed, Richard felt the walls between his professional persona and his true self beginning to crack. The quarterly profits and shareholder reports that had always driven his decisions seemed increasingly hollow against the reality of this community's life. When a young boy fell asleep against his leg, instead of stiffening as he might have done days ago, Richard found himself relaxing. Amara caught his eye across the fire and smiled. Not the challenging smile from their first meeting, but something warmer, more knowing. Later, walking back to his hotel under a sky brilliant with stars, Richard realized he'd spent an entire evening without once checking his phone or thinking about the deal. The thought should have alarmed him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long, artificial dream into something more real, more vital. The weight of his family's expectations, so present in every moment of his life, felt suddenly distant against the weight of what he'd witnessed. Back in his hotel room, Richard loosened his tie and stared at the dozens of unread emails on his laptop. The New York office needed updates, environmental impact reports required his signature, and his mentor had left 3 voicemails. But for the first time in his career, he couldn't focus on work. He opened the mining proposal document, scanning through pages of geological surveys and profit projections. Numbers that had once excited him now felt hollow. Every percentage point of projected profit carried the weight of Amara's words about poisoned streams and lost heritage. His phone buzzed. Another message from Thomas Pierce. Board expecting progress report tomorrow. Don't let personal considerations cloud your judgment. Personal considerations? Richard almost laughed at the corporate euphemism. Was that what you called it when you realized your life's work might be destroying something irreplaceable? He walked to the window, looking out over the village lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there, Amara was probably preparing for bed, perhaps thinking about their day together. The thought brought both comfort and anxiety. In her modest home, Amara sat at her small desk, surrounded by environmental research papers and community surveys. Her laptop displayed satellite images, showing the projected mining site's expansion over the next 5 years, a spreading stain across their ancestral lands. She found herself thinking about Richard's face when he watched the children at dinner, how his carefully maintained facade had cracked to reveal something more genuine. Unlike other corporate representatives who'd come before, he seemed capable of seeing beyond the bottom line. But was that enough? Her people couldn't eat good intentions. They needed their land, their water, their future. The next morning, Richard sat through a video conference with his team, his usual sharp focus notably absent. The project manager droned on about construction timelines and equipment deployment schedules. "Mr. White," a voice cut through his thoughts. "Your input on the relocation package." Richard looked at the document on his screen, a detailed plan to move the entire community to a modern housing development 50 miles away. The renderings showed concrete apartments and paved roads, everything that represented progress in corporate terms. "I need more time to review the cultural implications," he heard himself say. Silence fell over the virtual meeting. Richard White, known for his quick decisions and unwavering resolve, asking for more time. The project manager coughed nervously. "Sir, the board meeting is next week." "I said I need more time." Richard's tone ended the discussion. After the meeting, he walked to the conservation office where Amara worked. He found her organizing a community education session about water rights. When she saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to something more complex. "The mighty banker visits the grassroots activists," she teased, but her eyes were serious. "I need to understand more," he said, "about the land, the people, everything." "Why?" "So you can write a better relocation package." The accusation stung because it hit close to his earlier meeting. "No, because..." He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like corporate platitudes. "Because I need to know if I'm on the right side of this." Amara stepped closer, her proximity making his heart race in a way that had nothing to do with business. "And what if you discover you're not?" "What then, Richard?" "Go back to New York, write a nice report about cultural sensitivity, and let someone else handle the dirty work." "That's not fair." "None of this is fair." Her voice rose with passion. My people are fighting for survival, while your company discusses us like numbers on a spreadsheet. You walk in here with your expensive suit and corporate power, thinking a few days of playing cultural tourist gives you the right to. Richard closed the distance between them. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, their lips met in a kiss that surprised them both, fierce, desperate, and charged with all the tension that had been building between them. For a moment, the complex web of loyalties and obligations fell away, leaving only this connection. When they broke apart, Amara's eyes were wide with a mix of desire and anger. "This doesn't change anything," she whispered, but her hand remained on his chest. "It changes everything," Richard replied, and for the first time in his life, he had no plan, no strategy, no carefully calculated next move. The sound of approaching voices made them step apart. Community members began filtering in for the education session, their curious glances taking in Richard's presence and Amara's flushed face. As Richard walked back to his hotel, his phone buzzed continuously with messages from New York. But his mind was filled with the taste of Amara's lips and the realization that he could no longer pretend this was just another deal to close. The neat compartments of his life, career, duty, ambition were dissolving, leaving him in unknown territory without a map. Late into the night, Richard sat in his hotel room, his laptop casting a blue glow over scattered papers. What had started as routine due diligence had turned into something else entirely. His banking credentials gave him access to the company's complete database, and something wasn't adding up. Previous mining projects in Ghana, Congo, and Mozambique showed a pattern. He pulled up satellite images, comparing them with environmental impact reports. The minimal disruption promised in official documents looked very different from above. Vast scars across the landscape, dried up rivers, abandoned communities. His cursor hovered over a folder marked Executive Compensation. Confidential. He shouldn't have access to this. Someone had either been careless or... He clicked. Numbers filled his screen, but these weren't normal bonuses. Wire transfers to offshore accounts, consultancy fees to shell companies, payments to local officials marked as community development funds. A knock at his door made him jump. He slammed the laptop shut before remembering he'd asked room service for coffee. When he opened the door, instead of hotel staff, he found Amara. "I couldn't sleep," she said, stepping inside. "I keep thinking about everything." Richard glanced at his laptop. "I found something," he said, "but you're not going to like it." He reopened the files, and they spent the next hour going through documents. Amara's expression grew darker with each revelation. These communities, she pointed to a map, all displaced, just like they planned to do to us. And look at the cancer rates in this region after just 2 years of mining operations. "There's more," Richard said, pulling up the financial records. "The corruption goes all the way to the top. Thomas Pierce, my mentor, he's been orchestrating these deals for years." Amara turned to him, her eyes fierce. "You have to expose this. It's not that simple." "It is that simple. People are dying, Richard. Communities are being destroyed. How can you hesitate?" He stood up, pacing the room. "Pierce isn't just my mentor. He practically raised me in the business world. When my father was too busy for career guidance, Thomas was there. Every major deal, every promotion, he made it happen. And that justifies what he's doing. No, but..." Richard ran his hands through his hair. "If I do this, I'm not just burning bridges, I'm bombing them. My entire career, everything I've worked for, everything you've worked for, is built on the suffering of people like my community," Amara said quietly. "Deep down, you already know what you have to do. That's why you're still investigating at midnight, instead of signing off on the project." Richard stared out the window at the African night. In New York, the city lights would have obscured the stars. Here, they blazed with accusatory brightness. His phone rang, Thomas Pierce's name flashing on the screen. Richard let it go to voicemail. "I need to go back to New York," he said finally. "I have to look him in the eye when I ask about this." Amara stood, And if he has a perfectly reasonable explanation, if he convinces you it's all just standard business practice, he won't, Richard said. But his voice held a trace of uncertainty. I know what I saw in those documents. Do you? She moved closer. Because the Richard White who arrived here a week ago would have called it creative accounting, an aggressive business strategy. He turned to face her. I'm not that person anymore. Prove it. The next morning, Richard booked a flight to New York. Before leaving, he encrypted copies of all the documents he'd found and sent them to a secure email account. Insurance, he told himself, but against what? He wasn't sure. The familiar skyline of Manhattan greeted him with its usual indifference. His office looked exactly as he'd left it, but he felt like a stranger there. Family photos on his desk, sailing in the Hamptons, graduation from Harvard, his father's proud smile at his promotion ceremony, all seemed to belong to someone else. Thomas Pierce's corner office, still intimidated, even after all these years. The older man embraced him like a returning son. Richard, we've missed you here. Tell me you've got good news about our African venture. Richard placed a folder on the massive desk. I found some irregularities in the documentation. Oh, Pierce's smile didn't waver. Nothing serious, I hope. That depends, Richard said, watching his mentor's face carefully. On whether you consider systematic environmental destruction and corruption serious. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Pierce's smile remained, but his eyes turned cold. I taught you better than to throw around accusations, Richard. Business in developing regions requires flexibility. Flexibility? Is that what we're calling illegal waste dumping and bribing officials? Pierce leaned back in his chair. You sound like one of those idealistic protesters. Has the African sun addled your brain? Or perhaps, his smile turned, knowing, it's that pretty local activist I heard you've been spending time with. Richard felt a chill. How did Pierce know about Amara? Let me give you some fatherly advice, Pierce continued. Go back to Africa, close the deal, then take a nice long vacation. When you return, we'll pretend this conversation never happened. And if I don't, then I'd hate to see how certain regulatory bodies might react to evidence of your involvement in our more creative financial arrangements over the years. You've signed off on quite a few interesting documents, Richard. Your signature, your responsibility. Richard left the office with his head spinning. In the elevator, he loosened his tie, feeling like it was choking him. Pierce had been ready for his questions. Too ready. Which meant his phone buzzed with a text from Amara. Community meeting attacked by private security. They're moving faster than we thought. We need help. Richard pressed the lobby button, already pulling up airline schedules on his phone. The choice he'd been struggling with had just been made for him. Richard's return to Africa was marked by chaos. Private security contractors in unmarked vehicles patrolled the village perimeter. Construction equipment had appeared overnight, bulldozers and excavators squatting like metal predators at the edge of the community's land. He found Amara at the community center, organizing resistance efforts. Her usual composed demeanor had hardened into something fierce and defensive. When she saw him, relief flickered across her face before being replaced by urgency. They're not waiting for approval anymore, she said, spreading out a map marked with red circles. Security teams showed up yesterday. They're calling it site preparation, but they're really trying to intimidate us into leaving. Richard examined the map. Pierce knows I found the documents. He's accelerating everything before we can act. You confronted him. Her eyes widened. Richard, these people, you don't know what they're capable of. Actually, a new voice interrupted. He does now. Two men in dark suits approached them. Despite the heat, they wore shoulder holsters visible under their jackets. The taller one smiled without warmth. Mr. White, your presence here is no longer required. The board has relieved you of responsibility for this project. We suggest you return to New York immediately. Richard stepped between them and Amara. I'm afraid I don't take orders from corporate security, no. The shorter man produced a phone, playing a recording of Richard's conversation with Pierce. How about from the second call about your involvement in certain questionable transactions over the years? Get out. Amara's voice cracked like a whip. This is still our land. You have no authority here. The men withdrew, but their message was clear. Outside, the sound of heavy machinery grew closer. That evening, in the safety of Amara's family compound, Richard noticed her hands trembling as she made tea. The confident activist facade had cracked, revealing something more vulnerable. I've seen this before, she said quietly, sitting beside him. 5 years ago, in my mother's village. Richard waited, sensing she needed to tell this story. They came the same way. Men in suits talking about progress, showing glossy presentations about economic development. My uncle led the resistance. She paused, gripping her cup tighter. They found him in the river 3 months later. The police called it an accident. Amara, I'm so sorry. My mother's spirit broke after that. The mining company took the land, polluted the water table. Cancer rates soared. Children were born with defects. Her voice caught. I was studying environmental science in Cape Town when she got sick. By the time I came home, Richard reached for her hand, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers. That's why I came back here, to my father's village. I promised myself it wouldn't happen again. And now, she gestured helplessly at the window, where the construction lights blazed in the distance. It won't, Richard said firmly. This time is different, because of you. Her tone was both hopeful and skeptical. One reformed investment banker against a multinational corporation, because now we have evidence. Real evidence. Pierce was sloppy. He got too confident. Evidence only matters if we stay alive long enough to use it. She pulled away, pacing the small room. Those men today, they weren't just making threats, were they? Richard thought of Pierce's cold smile, the careful documentation of Richard's own signatures on questionable deals over the years. No, they weren't. A commotion outside drew their attention. Amara's father burst in, his usual dignity replaced by urgent concern. The contractors, they're moving in heavy equipment near the sacred burial grounds. They rushed outside. Under harsh floodlights, bulldozers were advancing toward an ancient grove of trees. Community members had formed a human chain, but security personnel were pushing them back. Those graves have been here for generations. Amara's voice shook with rage. They knew exactly what they were doing, choosing to start there. Richard watched the scene, his banker's mind calculating angles even now. They're trying to provoke a violent response. Give them an excuse to bring in more security, maybe even government forces. We won't give them one, Amara declared, though he could see the cost of restraint in her clenched fists. We're better than them. Through the night, they helped organize peaceful resistance. Richard used his corporate experience to advise protesters on their rights, while Amara coordinated with other communities who'd faced similar battles. The bulldozers withdrew before dawn, but everyone knew it was only a temporary retreat. As the sun rose, Richard found Amara at her mother's shrine, a small, private space behind her house. She was placing fresh flowers beside a photograph. She would have liked you, Amara said, without turning. Despite everything, she believed people could change, that they could choose to be better than their circumstances. Richard looked at the photograph, a woman with Amara's eyes and fierce determination. Tell me about her. As Amara shared stories of her mother's life and activism, the weight of what they were fighting for settled more deeply on Richard's shoulders. This wasn't just about one village or one mining project anymore. It was about breaking a cycle of corruption and destruction that had claimed too many lives, destroyed too many communities. His phone buzzed. Another threat from Pierce's people, but looking at Amara in the growing light, surrounded by her mother's memory and her people's determination, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. Absolute certainty about what was right. They had evidence of corruption, yes, but more importantly, they had something Pierce and his corporation couldn't understand. The power of a community fighting for its soul. Dawn highlighted the construction equipment waiting at the village edge. The coming days would test their resolve, their courage, and their growing bond. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, Richard and Amara drew strength from each other and the justice of their cause. The community hall was packed, humidity and tension making the air thick. Richard stood before the gathered villagers, his suit replaced by casual clothes, his corporate polish gone. He felt their skepticism like a physical force. "I know you have no reason to trust me," he began, his voice steady. "I came here representing the people who now threaten your home. But what I discovered," he activated a projector, displaying documents on the wall. "This isn't just about mining rights anymore." Satellite images showed the progression of destruction at other sites. Financial records revealed the pattern of corruption. Medical reports documented increased illness rates in affected communities. As Richard explained each piece of evidence, he watched understanding dawn on faces. Understanding followed by anger. Chief Okoro raised his hand. "You were part of this system. Why should we believe you've changed?" Before Richard could respond, an elderly woman stood. He recognized her from his first dinner here, the one who taught children about medicinal herbs. "I watched him with our children," she said. A man's heart shows in his eyes. His eyes have changed since he arrived. Murmurs filled the room. Amara, standing at the back, gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm not asking you to trust me," Richard continued. "I'm asking you to use me. I know how these people think. I know their tactics. And I know how to fight them." A young man called out. "Fight them with what?" "They have guns, machines, money. They have weapons," Richard acknowledged. "We have truth, and..." He paused. "We have their secrets." He revealed more documents, showing how the company had violated international laws, bribed officials, falsified environmental reports. The meeting lasted hours. When it ended, Richard had earned, if not trust, at least a chance to prove himself. It was a start. Later that night, in Amara's office, Richard received an encrypted email from a contact in New York. His face grew grave as he read. "They're planning to move within 48 hours, he said, showing Amara the message. "Pierce has arranged for government forces to support the security teams. They're calling it an anti-terrorist operation." Amara's hands clenched into fists. "They're going to label us terrorists. It's a classic tactic. They'll plant weapons, stage an incident, create an excuse for forced removal." Richard ran his hands through his hair. "We need to move faster. The elders are still debating whether to trust you," Amara reminded him. "We can't rush them. We may not have a choice." Richard pulled up more documents. "Look at this construction schedule. They're not just planning a mine. They're planning to dam the river, divert water for processing operations. The entire region's water supply would be at risk." A commotion outside interrupted them. One of the young village scouts burst in, breathing hard. More trucks arriving. "They're setting up some kind of base camp." From the office window, they could see the lights of heavy vehicles moving in the darkness. Floodlights snapped on, harsh white light cutting through the night. The mechanical sounds of construction equipment starting up filled the air. "They're not waiting for dawn," Richard realized. "They're starting now." Amara was already on her phone, activating the community's warning system. Within minutes, people were emerging from their homes, moving with practiced coordination to defensive positions they'd prepared. Richard watched the company's forces assembling and felt a chill. He recognized the tactical pattern from other sites he'd studied. They were positioning for a full encirclement. "Amara," he said urgently, "they're not just trying to intimidate anymore. This is a siege operation. They're going to cut off access roads, prevent media and supplies from reaching us." She looked at him, understanding the implications. "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour before they complete the perimeter." He showed her the tactical map on his tablet. "See these positions? Classic containment formation." Amara called an emergency meeting of community leaders. Within minutes, the chief's house was filled with determined faces. "My contact in New York sent their operational plans," Richard explained, displaying documents. They intend to isolate us, wear us down, create desperation, then stage an incident to justify armed intervention. We've faced threats before, one elder said. Not like this, Richard countered. They're not just trying to force you out anymore. They want to destroy any chance of resistance. Make an example of your community to frighten others. Silence fell as the implications sank in. Outside, the sound of machinery grew closer. Chief Okoro studied Richard's face. You were one of them. What would you have done before? Richard met his gaze. I would have seen it as necessary pressure to achieve business objectives. I would have justified it as progress. He swallowed hard. I was wrong, and now, the chief pressed. Now I understand what Amara has been saying. This land isn't just property to be bought and sold. It's life itself, and what they're doing isn't business. It's murder. The chief nodded slowly. Then help us fight them, not as an outsider seeking redemption, but as one of us protecting our home. Richard felt the weight of those words. He looked at Amara, saw the hope in her eyes, and made his decision. I'll show you everything I know about their tactics, every weakness, every pressure point. But we have to act fast. As the meeting dispersed, people moving purposefully to prepare for the coming confrontation, Amara touched Richard's arm. You're really choosing this, choosing us. You could still walk away, return to your life. Richard looked out at the community mobilizing in the darkness, then back at her. That life doesn't exist anymore. I can't go back to being the person I was. He squeezed her hand. This is where I belong. The night air carried the sounds of machinery, shouted orders, and the quiet determination of a community preparing to fight for its survival. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but tonight, Richard knew with absolute certainty that he was finally on the right side of history. The makeshift media center they'd set up in the community hall hummed with activity. Richard and Amara sat before a professional camera, ready to broadcast their two major news outlets. Months of evidence had been condensed into a 15-minute presentation that would reveal everything: the corruption, the environmental devastation, the human cost. 3 minutes to live, the young tech volunteer announced, adjusting the satellite uplink they'd smuggled in. Richard straightened his tie, his first time wearing one since leaving New York. Once we do this, there's no going back. We passed that point days ago, Amara replied, checking the USB drive containing their evidence. The broadcast began smoothly. Richard presented financial documents showing the money trail of bribes and kickbacks. Amara followed with environmental impact data and testimony from other affected communities. They were halfway through when the feed cut out. We're being jammed, the tech volunteer reported, fingers flying over keyboards. They're blocking all outgoing signals. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Final warning, walk away now. Attached was a video clip, security camera footage of his elderly mother entering her Manhattan apartment building, followed by two men in dark suits. They're threatening my family now, he said quietly to Amara. Her face hardened. They threatened mine years ago. Remember what happened? Before Richard could respond, his phone rang. His father's private number. He stepped outside to answer. What the hell do you think you're doing? His father's voice crackled with rage. Pierce just showed me evidence that you're attempting corporate espionage. Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation? Dad, Pierce is corrupt. The company that built everything we have, the company that paid for your education, that gave you every opportunity. His father's voice turned cold. Fix this, Richard. Whatever misguided crusade you're on, end it. Today, or what? Or you're no longer my son. The call ended. Richard stood in the African night, his father's words ringing in his ears. Behind him, he heard Amara organizing another attempt at broadcasting their message. Inside, the tech team had switched to Plan B, uploading their evidence to multiple secure servers. But each attempt was met with sophisticated cyber attacks. They're waiting for us, the tech volunteer reported. Every channel we try, they're there first. Amara's phone chimed with an alert from their perimeter security. More vehicles approaching, military vehicles this time. Richard checked the tactical map. They're positioning for a dawn raid. Classic intimidation move. Let us see them coming. Let fear do their work. His phone buzzed again. Pierce's number. I have to admit, Richard, you've surprised me. His mentor's smooth voice carried its usual charm. I thought you were smarter than this. Your father is quite disappointed. You've been watching my family. Insurance, my boy. Just insurance. But now I'm afraid we need to cash in that policy. You have 1 hour to leave the village and retract all allegations. After that, Pierce paused. Well, let's just say things will become unpleasant for everyone you care about. The threat hung in the air even after Richard ended the call. He found Amara organizing emergency supplies, preparing for the coming siege. They're threatening everyone I love, he said. She paused her work. And what about everyone here? The children who will get sick from contaminated water, the elders who will die when their medicinal plants are destroyed. Aren't they worth loving too? A commotion outside drew their attention. The community had gathered, watching military vehicles take position on the horizon. In the pre-dawn light, their weapons were clearly visible. Richard's phone filled with messages from college friends, business associates, family members. All urged him to stop, to think about his future, his career, his reputation. One message from his mother cut deepest. Richard, please, I don't understand what you're doing, but I'm scared. These men following me. He showed the message to Amara, his hands shaking. I brought this danger to them, to you, to everyone. No, she took his phone, held his gaze. Pierce and his corruption brought this danger. Your courage is fighting it. Courage. He laughed bitterly. I'm terrified. Good. It means you understand the stakes. She squeezed his hand. Fear doesn't make you weak, Richard. What you do despite the fear makes you strong. A young villager rushed in. They're broadcasting something on all local channels. They hurried to the media center. On every screen, Pierce was giving a press conference, painting a picture of eco-terrorists threatening development, of outside agitators manipulating local communities. Pictures of Richard appeared, labeled as a disgruntled ex-employee spreading lies. Perfect timing, Richard said grimly. Dawn raid coming, and they've already controlled the narrative. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from his father. The family lawyers are ready to disown you legally. Last chance, son. Think about your mother. Richard stared at the message, feeling the weight of generations of family expectations. Outside, vehicle engines growled closer. The tech team reported more signal jamming. The community gathered, watching, waiting. Amara touched his arm. Whatever you decide, decide it for the right reasons. Not from fear, not from guilt. Richard looked at his phone one last time, then turned it off. The right reason is standing right here, he said. And out there, he gestured to the community preparing to defend their home. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. The sun began to rise over the African landscape, revealing the full military force assembled against them. Richard and Amara stood together, watching dawn paint the sky in colors no Manhattan sunrise could match. So, she said quietly, what's our next move? Richard squared his shoulders, his decision made. The threats, the family pressure, the fear, all of it still existed. But somehow, standing here, it no longer held power over him. We fight, he said simply. Not their way, with threats and corruption, but our way, with truth. The morning light strengthened, illuminating the choice before them. Safety in surrender, or risk in resistance. Richard had spent his life choosing safe paths. Now, finally, he was ready to risk everything for something real. The Geneva-based NGO's offices gleamed with polished efficiency. Richard sat beside Amara in yet another video conference, watching hope fade from her face as the international director spoke. While we sympathize with your situation, the director said, her Swiss accent precise. Our organization must maintain neutrality. Corporate partnerships are essential to our global operations. Neutrality, Amara leaned forward. We have evidence of environmental crimes, human rights violations, which must be handled through proper channels. Have you considered filing a formal complaint with your government's Environmental Protection Agency? Richard muted their microphone. She knows that agency is compromised. I've seen the bribes in Pierce's records. The meeting ended like the others, with polite dismissals and empty promises to look into the situation. As the screen went dark, Amara slumped in her chair. That's the fourth major NGO this week, she said. All the same response. They're all connected, Richard explained, pulling up his research. Look at their boards of directors, their major donors. Pierce's corporate tentacles reach everywhere. Outside the makeshift office, the sounds of community organizing provided a sharp contrast to the sterile international bureaucracy they'd been facing. The village had transformed into a hub of resistance. People moved with purpose, maintaining barricades, organizing supplies, documenting everything with phones and cameras. Richard watched an elderly woman teaching young children traditional songs, while they helped sort medical supplies. Despite the military vehicles still visible on the horizon, life and resistance continued. Maybe we're approaching this wrong, he said slowly. We're trying to fight a corporate giant with corporate weapons. Amara looked up from her notes. What do you mean, these NGOs? They're part of the same system. They speak the language of boardrooms and policy papers. He gestured outside. But our real strength is out there. As if to emphasize his point, drums began to sound from the village center. It was time for the daily community gathering, a tradition that had taken on new meaning during the siege. They walked to the gathering, where hundreds of community members had assembled. The transformation over the past weeks was remarkable. What had started as a scared group facing corporate threats had become an organized resistance movement. Chief Okoro stood to address the crowd. Our friends from other villages report more communities joining our cause. The mining company's reputation is already suffering, even without the big NGO's help. A young woman raised her hand. My video of the military vehicles got 50,000 views online. People are asking questions. The company's stock dropped 6 points yesterday, Richard added. Small shareholders are getting nervous about the negative publicity. The chief nodded. We don't need those big organizations. We have something stronger, unity. As if to prove his point, a convoy of trucks appeared on the horizon. But instead of military vehicles, these were packed with supporters from neighboring communities. They carried supplies, cameras, and most importantly, more voices ready to join the protest. The company's security forces stopped the convoy at their checkpoint. Richard watched through binoculars as an argument ensued. Then, slowly, the trucks were allowed through. The security team, unwilling to create another viral video of harassment. See, Amara squeezed his hand. Every person who joins us makes it harder for them to maintain their narrative. The new arrivals brought stories from other affected communities, each one adding weight to their cause. A farmer whose crops had died from contaminated groundwater, a teacher whose students had developed mysterious illnesses, a youth activist with footage of destroyed sacred sites. Richard found himself working with a group of young tech-savvy protesters, teaching them how to decode corporate financial statements, while learning from them how to maximize social media impact. His Wall Street expertise was being repurposed as a weapon against the very system that had created it. Your corporate presentation skills are useful, after all, Amara teased, watching him help craft messages that would resonate with international audiences. Know your enemy, he replied. Pierce taught me that, ironically. As night fell, the community gathered for a traditional ceremony, not just ritual now, but an act of defiance. Hundreds of voices raised in song, loud enough to reach the military camps beyond their barricades. A young man who'd arrived with the convoy approached Richard. I used to work for one of the company's other mines, he said. What they did to my village, I can't let it happen again. Others shared similar stories throughout the evening. Each account strengthened their resolve, added another thread to the tapestry of resistance they were weaving. Later, Richard and Amara sat reviewing the day's developments. His laptop showed growing social media engagement, spreading awareness far beyond their remote location. We don't need the NGO's permission to tell our story, Amara realized. The world is listening anyway. Pierce doesn't understand this kind of power, Richard added. He thinks everything can be bought or intimidated. But you can't, by genuine solidarity. A message popped up on his screen, another threatening note from Pierce's team. But this time, Richard smiled. What? Amara asked. They're still trying to scare us with corporate tactics. Meanwhile, we're building something they can't touch. He showed her the latest analytics. Every threat they make, every attempt to silence us, just makes our message spread further. The night air carried the sounds of conversation and community from the gathering outside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had discovered a different kind of strength, one that couldn't be measured in stock prices or profit margins. As if reading his thoughts, Amara said softly, "My mother used to say that true power comes from the earth and the people who protect it. I never fully understood until now." Richard watched the firelight dance on faces filled with determination and hope. In his former life, he had wielded what he thought was power, money, influence, corporate authority. Now he understood. Real power grew from the ground up, nurtured by truth and community. The military vehicles still loomed on the horizon, but they no longer seemed as threatening. Pierce could marshal all the forces of corporate might, but he couldn't fight an idea whose time had come. The people had found their voice, and it was growing stronger every day. The night pressed heavily around Richard and Amara as they sat in her small office, the weight of their next decision hanging between them. The community's peaceful resistance had been effective, but Pierce's latest moves threatened to destroy everything they'd built. "They're going to start construction at dawn," Richard said, pointing to intercepted documents on his laptop. "Pierce isn't waiting for permits anymore. He's calling it emergency resource development under some obscure national security law." Amara paced the room, the strain of weeks of resistance visible in her movements. "We can't stop bulldozers with protest songs." "No," Richard agreed, "but we can stop them with this." He pulled up a complex diagram. "Pierce is holding a secret board meeting tomorrow night at the company's regional headquarters. Every major player will be there, including government officials they've bribed." "How do you know this?" "Because I was supposed to be there." He showed her the invitation on his phone. "Pierce still thinks he can bring me back to his side. He doesn't know I've turned over everything to investigative journalists." "But nothing's been published yet," Amara said. "The journalists are still verifying, and Pierce's lawyers are threatening them." Richard stood, his decision crystallizing. "That's why I need to get into that meeting, record everything, get irrefutable proof of their plans." He met her eyes. No more deniability, no more delays. Amara's face paled as she understood. "It's too dangerous. The security, I know their protocols. I helped design them." He pulled up building schematics on his laptop. "And I still have active security credentials." Pierce's ego prevented him from canceling them. It would mean admitting I'm really against him. "If they catch you, they'll do what they're planning to do anyway." He touched her shoulder. "But if I succeed, we'll have everything we need to stop them, permanently." Their discussion was interrupted by sounds of distress from outside. They rushed to find a group of villagers gathered around the community well. The water had turned a sickly brown color, carrying a chemical smell. "They're poisoning the groundwater." Amara's voice shook with rage. "Just like they did to my mother's village." Richard took samples, his corporate training now serving a different purpose. "They're trying to force an evacuation, make it look like a natural contamination event." He checked his watch. "The board meeting is in 18 hours. If I leave now?" "No." Amara grabbed his arm. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way." He gestured at the contaminated well. "This is just the beginning. You know what comes next." They returned to her office, where Richard laid out his plan. He would use his credentials to enter the building during the meeting, plant recording devices, and download files from the secure server room. Simple in theory, potentially fatal in practice. "At least let me come with you," Amara pleaded. "You're needed here. If something goes wrong," he hesitated. "The community will need your leadership." The unspoken weight of their growing feelings filled the room. Weeks of fighting side by side, of sharing dangers and hopes, had created something neither of them had expected. Something they hadn't had time to fully acknowledge. "Richard," she said softly, "I can't lose someone else to these people." He stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. "You helped me find my conscience, Amara. Now let me use it." Their kiss was desperate, full of things unsaid and futures uncertain. When they broke apart, Amara pressed something into his hand, a small carved wooden pendant. "My mother's protection charm," she explained. "She wore it during her protests." Richard slipped it around his neck, tucking it under his shirt. The wood was warm against his skin, carrying the weight of generations of resistance. The next few hours passed in careful preparation. Richard changed back into his corporate armor, expensive suit, leather shoes, the costume of his former life. Each piece felt like a betrayal of his new truth. But that was the point. He had to become Richard White, ambitious banker, one last time. As he prepared to leave, the village elders gathered to perform a protection ceremony. Richard watched the ancient rituals with new eyes, understanding now what he couldn't when he first arrived. The power of connection, of community, of fighting for something larger than oneself. Chief Okoro approached him afterward. "You are no longer the man who came to take our land," he said. "You have become a warrior for truth. Remember that when you walk in the house of lies." Dawn was breaking as Richard made his final preparations. His phone showed multiple missed calls from Pierce, each one increasing the chance that his ruse would work. Let them think he was wavering, considering a return to the fold. Amara helped him check the recording equipment one last time. Her hands lingered on his jacket, straightening what didn't need straightening. 18 hours, he promised. "If I'm not back, don't." She pressed her forehead to his. "Just come back." Richard gazed out at the village, now fully awake and preparing for another day of resistance. Children carried water from the remaining clean wells. Elders taught young people traditional songs of struggle. His two worlds had never seemed further apart, or his choice more clear. "Pierce thinks money is power," he said. "But real power is knowing what you're willing to die for." He touched the wooden pendant. "And what you're willing to live for." The sound of approaching vehicles signaled his ride trusted allies, who would get him to the city. Time had run out. One last kiss, fierce and quick. One last look at the community that had taught him the meaning of justice. Then Richard White straightened his tie and walked toward the waiting car, carrying the hopes of a people and the weight of his own redemption into the heart of enemy territory. The corporate headquarters loomed against the African sunset, its glass and steel architecture an alien intrusion in the landscape. Richard passed through security with practiced ease, his old credentials and Pierce's lingering invitation granting him access. The wooden pendant felt warm against his chest, a reminder of everything at stake. In the marble lobby, a news broadcast played silently on massive screens. Footage of the village protest, carefully edited to look like violent unrest. Richard's hand tightened on his briefcase, containing recording equipment and a secure drive for downloading files. "Richard," Pierce's voice boomed across the lobby. "I knew you'd come to your senses." Richard turned, facing his mentor with a carefully constructed smile. Hard to ignore that many phone calls. "Thomas," Pierce clapped him on the shoulder, steering him toward the elevators. "The board's assembling upstairs. Your father will be pleased you're here." The mention of his father sent a chill through Richard. He hadn't known the older White would be present, though it made sense. The family had too much invested in Pierce's operations. The executive boardroom occupied the top floor, its windows offering a commanding view of the territory they sought to control. Government officials mingled with corporate executives, champagne flowing freely. Richard recognized faces from his investigation, judges who had signed illegal permits, politicians who had accepted bribes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pierce announced, "look who's returned to the fold." Richard endured handshakes and backslaps, playing the prodigal son while carefully positioning himself near the main conference table. The recording devices in his briefcase would need proper placement to capture everything. His father approached last, martini in hand. "Finally seen reason, have you?" "I've seen a lot of things lately," Richard replied carefully. The meeting began. Richard waited for his moment, asking to be excused just as Pierce began his presentation. In the hallway, he moved quickly to the server room, using the access codes he'd memorized from the stolen documents. Inside, he plugged in the secure drive, starting the download of confidential files. His hands flew over the keyboard, years of banking work making the technical infiltration almost automatic. A voice behind him froze his blood. "I taught you better than this, son." Richard turned. His father stood in the doorway, not looking surprised at all. "How long have you known?" Richard asked. "That you were playing us, since you returned. No son of mine would choose peasants over profit." His father stepped into the room. "The real question is, how long have you known?" "Known what?" "That this was all my plan. Pierce, he's just the public face. The fall guy, if needed." His father smiled coldly. "Who do you think arranged your assignment here? Who made sure you'd meet that passionate young activist?" Richard's mind raced, reassessing everything. "You wanted me to find the corruption. I wanted you to be tested, to see if you were worthy of taking over." His father sipped his martini. "Pierce is becoming a liability, too aggressive, too visible. We needed a cleaner image for the next phase. You, the reformed corporate raider, fighting for environmental justice." He chuckled. "Perfect PR, the threats, the poisoned well, necessary pressure. Business is like chess, Richard. Sometimes you sacrifice pieces to win the game." The wooden pendant felt heavy against Richard's chest. All this time, he'd thought he was fighting the system, when the system was playing him in a deeper game. His father extended his hand. "Come upstairs. Help me announce the company's new direction. Under your leadership, we'll present a kinder face while expanding operations tenfold." Richard looked at his father's offered hand, seeing for the first time the true cost of the White family legacy. Generations of manipulation, of treating lives like commodities. "No," he said quietly. "No." His father's smile hardened. "Don't be foolish. This was always the plan, your plan." Richard pressed a button on his phone, then turned the screen to show his father. "And it's been broadcasting live for the past 5 minutes." The boardroom erupted in chaos above them. Pierce's voice echoed down the hallway, shouting about phones and signals. Richard's father lunged for the secure drive, but Richard was faster. Security alarms blared. In the distance, police sirens wailed. Not the bought-off local force, but federal agents Richard had contacted through journalists. The timing had to be perfect. "You really think you can stop this?" his father demanded. "Everything we've built." "No," Richard said, "but I can help them stop themselves." He nodded toward the lobby, where reporters were pushing through the doors, cameras flashing. Amara stood among them, leading a group of international observers and human rights lawyers. The carefully controlled corporate narrative crumbled in real time. Board members fled past them, trying to avoid cameras. Pierce's voice rose in panic from the boardroom. And through it all, Richard's father stared at him with something like respect. "You arranged all this?" he asked. "Used my own strategy against me." "I learned from the best," Richard replied. "You taught me to play chess, remember?" Federal agents reached their floor. Richard's father straightened his tie, dignity intact even in defeat. "Well played, son. Well played." As his father was led away, Richard felt the weight of generations lifting from his shoulders. Outside, the sun was rising over the African landscape. In the distance, he could see the village, where he'd found his true purpose. Amara found him in the lobby, surrounded by the chaos of Pierce's crumbling empire. Without words, she took his hand. "Your father," she asked, "will face justice, along with the others." He touched the wooden pendant. "But that's not the end. It's just the beginning." She understood. Exposing corruption was one thing. Building something better in its place, that was the real challenge. "Ready to help us rebuild?" she asked. Richard looked at the sunrise, painting the sky in colors no corner office could match. The morning light caught the carved patterns of the wooden pendant, casting shadows that looked like the community's traditional patterns. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it more than any deal he'd ever closed. Together, they walked out of the corporate fortress and toward the village that had become his true home. Behind them, an empire of greed collapsed under the weight of truth. Ahead lay the harder but infinitely more rewarding task of healing the land and its people. The morning air carried the sounds of victory songs from the village. Richard White, no longer banker or corporate heir, but simply a man who had found his truth, walked toward them with hope in his heart and the warmth of Amara's hand in his. Some battles end with handcuffs and court dates, but the real victories, he had learned, were measured in restored lands, protected waters, and communities standing strong together. That would be his legacy, not the one he was born to, but the one he had chosen.